Hi and welcome to the Nebula Block of the Month. I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts and I'll be here once a month to give an overview for each month. We're now here in month 11. Last month in month 10 we worked on putting our blocks together into our wedges and putting our wedges together into a quilt top, and now we have a finished quilt top. So the next step is quilting. And here you have two main choices. You can quilt it yourself or you can send it to a long arm quilter. If you're going to quilt it yourself, you're going to make a sandwich with your backing, your batting of choice, and your quilt top, and use basting pins. Go ahead and quilt as desired. If you're going to send it to a long arm quilter, similar process. You're going to gather your backing, your batting, and your top, but instead of basting it yourself, you're going to send it onto your long arm quilter, let them put it on their frame, quilt it, and once you get it back, the next step is binding. And binding is something that is near and dear to my heart, and I have a lot of tips and techniques, so I'm going to go ahead and show them to you here. I'm going to take this lap quilt that I finished and send it off to Teresa of Quilting Is My Bliss, and I'll be back here in just a moment with this quilted, just like magic, to show you how we're going to do our binding. Teresa Silva of Quilting Is My Bliss custom quilted the Nebula quilt on the cover of the pattern. If you want to long arm quilt your Nebula quilt yourself, Teresa recommends the chapter devoted to motifs on pages 23 to 53 in her book, Long Arm Quilting Workbook. You'll find lots of ideas there. Books are available on her website at quiltingismybliss.com. Teresa's goal was for the quilting to accent the quilt rather than be the star of the quilt. One way that she worked to achieve this was to use tone-on-tone thread color for each block and the background of the quilt. Teresa shared that she changed out thread colors as she quilted the center blocks. A tip that she offered is to try and find a thread that will blend through a group of blocks, such as the green-yellow blocks. Try a lime green thread to blend over all of them. The same trick works with the purple and blue blocks. Choose a thread that might blend through all of those blocks so you have less thread changes. For the background, she chose Cotton Candy by Glide Thread. It's a very light pink thread and it blended away perfectly. Another option for the background is to use Bone by Glide. It's kind of a grayish white color and actually blends away nicely. That way you can use only one thread color for the entire background. Either Bone or Cotton Candy will work well. In the center of the quilt, she accented the blocks with ruler work and free motion quilting that would complement the design of each block. Teresa used a lot of wishbone, ribbon candy, swirls, and straight lines to quilt Nebula. To enhance the angular lines of the quilt design, in the background diamond, she repeated the same pattern of dot-to-dot quilting filled in with the ribbon candy motif. If you'd like to have a professional quilter use an edge-to-edge digital design on your Nebula quilt, Teresa recommends selecting circular patterns. They play well off of the angles. Teresa recommends Dizzy Izzy, Seafoam, Double Bubble, Soho, and Caramel. Any edge-to-edge design that is more curved works really well with this quilt. If you'd like, you can send your quilt top to Teresa for quilting. Turnaround time for an edge-to-edge design is around 1 to 2 weeks most of the time. Her custom work is booked out for the next 6 to 8 months at this time. Learn more at quiltingismybliss.com. Hopefully now you have some ideas on how you want your Nebula quilt top to be quilted. My lap size Nebula just arrived back from Teresa and I'm super happy with it. I had her do the Seafoam pantograph on it. Since I had her custom quilt, my other one I wanted to show the variety, and I'm planning on using this one on our couch. So you can really see it pop here in the darker blue block. Because she used a lighter thread, it blends in more into some of the other areas. And I opted to go with this print from Curiouser and Curiouser on the back. I think it has a lot of fun colors that pop from the front of the quilt. So the next step is to get this trimmed and begin my binding. Before we jump into binding, we need to go ahead and trim the excess off our quilt. Some people actually leave this on while they put their binding on and then trim it. I find it's best to trim at this stage, but you do what you're comfortable with. Depending on if you're doing the lap or which size, you may have points that are coming to your edge that are in different colors like this. Since I'm doing the lap, all of mine are the same fabric, so it's not as essential, but you want to make sure that you're cutting a 1/4 inch away from these points if you're going to be putting your binding on with a 1/4 inch seam, which is the pretty typical standard. So I'm going to line my ruler up and just kind of eyeball and check that my 1/4 inch line is on top of my points, and you can kind of pull your quilt one way or the other as needed, and just begin to trim it. And then I'm just gonna slide my quilt and continue this process to trim all the way around my quilt. Now that I have my quilt all trimmed, I need to go ahead and start to make my binding. So binding, you have different options here. You can cut it straight of grain, or you can cut it bias. And I prefer bias, especially for quilts that are going to be used a lot. It's stronger. The directions give you straight of grain because that's what most people do. So straight of grain is going to be fabric folded off the bolt, and take your, which folded off the bolt means selvages together. And you're going to take your ruler and go along and cut your strips at 2 1/4 or 2 1/2, whatever you prefer. Bias, we are going to cut our strips diagonally. Now we want to make sure we open this fabric up. And there are ways to do continuous bias binding. There's a lot of different ways. This is just what I do, which is I make sure that I have a fabric piece that is big enough. This is a little more than 1/2 yard, which should give me plenty of fabric to bind my lap. I think I need about 280 inches, give or take. So I took my piece and I folded it up at a 45-degree angle. So my selvage edge is now up against my cut edge, and my cut edge is up against the fold from the bolt. And I'm just gonna go ahead and cut. And now I'm going to cut, I'm gonna do 2 1/4 inches. So I'm just gonna go ahead and cut 2 1/4 inch strips from this. And I'm gonna go till close to the end, but I don't wanna have super, super tiny pieces. So I'll probably stop a little before the corner. So I'm just gonna keep going, making sure that my straight line here stays with here so that these pieces are straight and don't turn into, have a slight V, as can happen if your fold is not perpendicular to your straight line that you're cutting with your ruler. And that's probably where I'm gonna stop. I can always cut another piece from this small triangle if I need it. So now I have this little pile of strips here. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rotate this around and continue cutting. I would recommend that you press. I didn't go ahead and do that ahead of time, but best if you don't have harsh lines. I'll probably press before I continue cutting up here, but just gonna go ahead and continue cutting 2 1/4 inch strips for my whole piece. And then when I have this whole piece cut, I will take them over to my sewing machine and match these up, 1/4 inch seam and sew. I may or may not try and match up some of the rainbows. Since it's such a variety of color, it's not really gonna bug me if it's not matched up, but if that matters to you, you can go ahead and do that. So match those up, 1/4 inch seam, press that open to make the length of my binding. Now that I have my binding strips cut, I am putting them together. And sometimes I'll trim the selvage off ahead of time so that I don't have to worry about it now, but I didn't. Just kind of forgot about it, and it's not really a problem. So what I will do is find 2 pieces that have the same angle, because some are gonna have this angle and some are gonna have that angle. So let me find another one. All right, here we go. And this also has the selvage on it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna overlap them enough so there's a 1/4 inch without the selvage. Sew from point to point and trim all that off when I am done putting my binding pieces together. So I'm gonna sew that and then just grab another piece, and I have decided not to worry about matching up the colors at all. There's so much variety here that I think it'll just look great either way. So I'm going to continue piecing my bias binding strips together. I just finished chain piecing all of my binding strips together, so I'm going to snip the little chains of threads that connect one to the next. And some of these need no trimming, and then some of them do need trimming. So if they need trimming, I'm just going to go ahead and use my scissors and cut about 1/4 inch. Doesn't need to be exact because the seam itself is already sewn. So I'm going to do that to any of the ones that need to be trimmed. And then I will press all of these seams open to have as little bulk as possible in the binding. So I'm going to go over to my iron, just like I press seams open in the quilt. I'm going to use my seam roller, roll these open, press these seams open, and then I will press my binding right sides together, the raw edge to the raw edge. I'm now ready to attach my binding to my quilt, and I'm going to sew it onto the right side and then wrap it around to the wrong side to complete it, and I can either machine or hand stitch from there. I'll show you some options. So I'm going to start with about a 8 to 10 inch tail so that I have flexibility in joining this to the end for a seamless finish. And I'm going to sew this on with my 1/4 inch seam allowance because that's what I accounted for when I trimmed my quilt top. Sometimes people do like to do it a little smaller or bigger. And I'm going to back stitch here just a little bit at the beginning and just going to sew till I get to a corner. Okay, so I'm now a couple inches away from my corner, and most people are familiar with doing a 90-degree corner because most quilts are square or rectangle. And in that case, you would sew till 1/4 inch before, fold it over, 90-degree angle to this side, fold it over, and keep going. Very similar for a hexagon, but what we're going to do is we're going to sew to basically this seam that we have here. So it's 1/4 inch, and then instead of folding it out 90 this way, we're going to fold it up in a straight line away from where we're going. So that's always a trick, whether you're doing a 60-degree, an 80-degree, a 90, whatever it is. The trick is that you want to go in a straight line away from where you're going, and then fold it back and keep going. And that's going to give you the perfect amount of fabric here to create a very good looking miter. So I'll show you what this looks like. I'm going to slow down, and I'm eyeballing it because I've done this a lot. If you are not comfortable eyeballing before you get to the end, I suggest taking a ruler, laying it on top of here, and lightly with a pencil drawing a line so you know exactly where you need to stop. So I'm not going to trim my threads. I'm going to keep them attached to my machine. I'm going to fold this, like I said, away, straight line, and then back on top so that I have my miter. I'm going to go back under my machine. So this is what it's going to look like. Sewed, then made my miter, and now when I go to flip it around, I'm going to have a perfectly mitered corner. And one tip when it comes to flipping it around is I always talk about split the bulk, which means there's bulk in the miter, and on the front the bulk is over here. And so in the back I want the bulk to be on this side. So what that means is if I folded this one first and then this one, the bulk is over here on the left again, which means all the bulk is over here, which is doesn't make for the neatest corner, and it gets bulky, hence the word bulk. So I'm going to fold the side first that has the bulk, and then the side that doesn't have the bulk. So I'm splitting the bulk. So now I have more bulk over here, so it makes for a more even corner. I have now sewn my binding almost all the way around my quilt, and it's time to attach these two pieces. And I'm going to start by taking the shorter of the two tails, the one that I started with, moving that one out of the way, and taking the longer one and matching up the raw edges of the binding along the raw edge of the quilt. And then I'm going to open it up. And you'll see I have a seam that ends up being really close. Not ideal, but it happens, and this is real. So we're going to open this up and just kind of smooth it in place and make sure that we don't have it pulled too far or any bumps in it. We want it nice and smooth. So open that up. Then we're going to take this one and we're going to lay it back down, and we're going to open this one up. So we can see where they're going to match up. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a pencil. We're going to lightly draw my line. Now I need to add a 1/2 inch to that so that I have enough seam allowance to sew these two together. And because they're biased and they're going to have a little bit of stretch, I'm actually going to add a little bit less than 1/2 inch rather than be generous and add a little bit more because I don't want it to bubble. And when I say slightly less, I mean slightly less, not a lot less. I have this little handy dandy triangle ruler that is nice because I can do the 1/2 inch and make sure that I'm staying at the 45 degrees, but you can do this with many other ruler options as well. So I'm just going to line this up and make sure that I'm staying straight, you know, for the most part. You obviously got to pull that over there. So straight here, and then I'm going to find my mark and a little bit less than 1/2 inch past my mark. I'm going to draw my line. And now I can either rotary cut this or I can cut it with scissors. I do recommend moving your quilt out of the way if you're going to use a rotary cutter so that you don't accidentally cut your quilt. Don't ask me how I know that. Been there, done that. So my scissors can sometimes be easier here. Okay. So now I'm going to move my excess binding out of the way. And now I am left with these two tails. And they overlap the right amount. And so what I want to do is I want to open them up, match them, and take them to my sewing machine so that I can sew my 1/4 inch seam to finish my loop of binding. So now here I am at my machine, and I want to make sure, double check that I did not accidentally twist one of these the wrong way. If you do, it's an easy enough seam to pick out, but don't want to have to do that if you don't need to. And I'm going to overlap these so that I get 1/4 inch from valley to valley. And you can pin these if you find that helpful. I'm just gonna go for it. Okay. I've got my 1/4 inch foot, and I've got thread that matches my binding. Okay, so now I have that sewn together. I'm gonna lay that out, give myself a little bit of a double check. Looks good. I'm gonna open it, and I'm gonna finger press that seam. You can get your iron out for this, but if you don't have it on, it's kind of, you know, I don't know that I would turn my iron on just for this one seam at this point, and I don't have my iron on right now. So I'm gonna use my seam roller, and then fold that, and then use my seam roller again. Now I'm going to take this back to the machine and sew from here to finish getting my binding onto my quilt. And I started a little bit before just to overlap my stitching, make sure everything is nice and secure. And I'll probably trim these off once I get the binding on. You can trim them off ahead of time if they get in your way. And do a little back stitch. So now I have my binding complete, and I'm going to go ahead and snip those little pieces off. The next step is to wrap my binding around to the back of the quilt to finish my binding. And regardless of whether you're going to do this by hand or by machine, I find Wonder clips to be essential and helpful in this process to create the crisp corners that you're going to want with your miters. So I generally start with clipping my corners first, and then I move to my straight areas. So I'm just going to wrap it around to the back, and you want to make sure your binding is full of batting and your backing. I have seen sometimes where people were taught to put their binding right to that stitching edge, and then you kind of have this like hollow area. You don't want any hollow open areas in your binding. So you don't want to be super tight. You don't want to wrap it to the back itself, but you want to go just to the edge of everything there so you have a nice full binding. And put a clip. Another clip. So I'm just going to do a couple on either side of the miter. Okay, now I'm going to pull this kind of, not super tight, but a little taut just to kind of get that nice crisp edge out. Then I'm going to flip and work from the back side. And as mentioned when we were sewing the binding on, I want to make sure to split the bulk. So since my bulk on the front is over here on my right side, I want my bulk in the back to be on my left side, which means I want to wrap my bulk side first. So I want to wrap this one first. I'm going to add another clip. And then I want to wrap this side. And you want to make sure you don't tuck it all the way up there, because then your miter on the back would look like that. And that's not as pretty. We want to make sure that we tuck just a little bit, the same amount that we tucked on the front, so that our miter in the back matches. So we have a nice 60-degree coming in there. And put a clip. And I'm going to roll the rest of it over and put a clip. Now I'm just going to turn it to the front, take this one off for a second, double check. That looks great. I'm happy with it. Put that clip. And I'm going to move on to my next corner, and then I'm going to move on and do all of my straight sides. Now here's where you have a choice. You can go ahead and you can sew this on by hand, or you can sew this by machine. I love hand sewing binding. I love the look of it. I love the calm, slow, meditative, but let's be honest, we don't always have time. And I have two very little kids, which means my free time is very limited right now. And as a result, I know that if I wait to do the hand binding on this quilt, it's going to be a very long time before I get to use it. And I want to use it right now. And as a result, I am going to machine bind this quilt. There's times I actually recommend machine binding if something is going to be washed very frequently. Machine binding can hold up better over time. So if it's going to be something for a baby or a young kid or on your bed and you plan on washing it regularly, machine binding is actually a better option. So think about that. You have options here. There's many different ways to do machine binding. Some involve sewing in the back first and wrapping it to the front. Because of the points of this quilt, I prefer to do this method where you start on the front and go to the back. So I'm now going to show you how I will machine bind the binding onto this quilt. I've switched my machine to a walking foot. I used my 1/4 inch foot when sewing the binding onto the front of the quilt, but now that I'm going to be going through the bulk of the entire quilt and the binding and all of that, I find it's helpful to use my walking foot. So I'm first just going to sew on a little scrap, just as a leader ender, so I don't end up with that little thread nest underneath. And I'm just going to pick any side, straight side to start on. And what I usually will do is remove one clip so that I have a big enough area here that my walking foot is not going to interfere with anything. And what I'm going to do is simply sew directly to the left, like one thread to the left of my binding. And because I use 2 1/4, that should catch my binding on the back. And if there's anywhere that it doesn't, I can touch that up later by machine or by hand. But I'm just going to sew one thread to the left, and I'm going to use a thread that matches my binding, because on the front I should say a thread that matches this part of your quilt. In my case, it's the same because on the front, the thread is going to be right next to the binding, and so it's going to go onto your backing or your background fabric. And on the back, the thread is going to end up on your binding. So I am using my favorite 2600 Aurifil because that gray actually perfectly matches with this print from Tula Pink. So I'm just going to start right here, and I'm going to backstitch a little bit. And slow and steady, and removing the wonder clips as I go. And I'm basically going to sew this in 2 to 3 inch sections, nice and slow, all the way around the quilt. And also just enough to be able to show you guys what it's going to look like. Okay. So if I pull this piece over, you can see basically about a little less than 1/8 of an inch in is my stitching. And this is how I'm going to finish my quilt. So I am now going to sew around my entire quilt to finish my binding. Many of you will be making square or rectangular Nebula quilts. So I want to quickly go over how to do the binding if you are doing 90-degree corners. Just as we started with a tail on the hexagon, we're going to do the same thing here. I am showing you on a Lucky Charm pillow because I don't have a square nebula to bind right now. So just imagine this is your nebula. And you're going to start with it in the middle of something. I'm going to do close to a corner since that's the part that I want to feature and show you guys. So we're going to sew that same 1/4 inch. And we're going to stop a 1/4 inch before we get to the edge of our quilt. I like to back stitch, and then I leave that on. I don't trim that. I flip it so that it's 90 degrees, so it's straight from where I'm going. And then I flip it back so that I'm going to have a nice miter. Turn my project and continue sewing. And the same thing that we talked about with the lap size, about splitting the bulk, we're going to do with the queen or the king as well if we have 90-degree corners. So when we go to flip this around, and I'm going to grab some wonder clips, we're going to clip the sides first. So put at least one clip in either side so that we can then focus on our corner. So we're going to give it a little tug, just like we did with the other one. And since our bulk is over here, we want to make sure to wrap that side first so that our bulk in the back ends up over here. So we're going to start by wrapping that side. Then we're going to give it a little pull. And in this case, we do tuck it because of the 90-degree. And then we're going to end up with that nice 45-degree miter. So I'm going to grab another clip. Giving myself double check. Looks like my miter's off a tiny bit, so I'll just kind of ease it till I'm happy with it. And then I'll check on the front. Looks good on the front. And so I'm good to go. And the last thing that I want to go over about finishing your Nebula quilt is labeling. I highly encourage that you label your quilt. Many of you will have this label, but if you don't, go ahead and make your own label. I often use woven ones like this that I put into the binding before I bind it, or I print some of my own that are similar to this with my name on it at Spoonflower. But it's so important to label your quilt because unfortunately, we're not always going to be here. Your quilt might get lost, and your label is how it's going to get back to you, is how someone's going to know who made it, who spent all this time putting this beautiful project together. So I highly encourage that you label your quilt. After you get your quilt bound, enjoy it. Baby William is taking Nebula for a spin for the first time. Yes, a big brother got to hang out with the original one, and now this guy's getting to hang out with this one. I hope you all have enjoyed making your Nebula quilt and enjoy it as much as we enjoy ours. Oh yeah? You got stories to tell? You got stories to tell? Say bye, everybody.